If you struggle to focus when reading, here's why you can have hope that you'll be able to turn this around. My issues with losing focus while reading started back in 1998. They still persist, and they're probably more extreme than yours. But I have found solutions. Now, some of my solutions are probably more extreme than anything you've encountered before, but they are very, very powerful. There's reasons why I use them. And, content may be king, but context is God. So let me set the scene of how I discovered some of the focus techniques specifically for reading that I'm going to share with you today so that you'll know why I use them and how that I find them useful. And then when you experiment with them, you have that full context. A lot of people, they don't get enough context, and that's why they struggle to focus. They don't have a frame in which to situate the information. They're always looking for tips and tricks and nuggets, and that's just not really the way a lot of information works. So here's the context. I nearly dropped out of grad school in 2003 because I could barely focus on a sentence. And the problem had actually started back in 1998. But it was particularly dark that winter of 2003, and I was not feeling well at all. I had looming exams that made the stress even worse, and that led to a vicious cycle that degraded my concentration further. But I knew I just had to solve the problem. And I'd gone to a speed reading course that took place on York University campus at night. Somebody had rented a room there. I don't know why the university would allow that, but nonetheless, it was there. I learned absolutely nothing from that course other than eye movement techniques that totally hurt my eyes and gave me headaches. And it really just had weird ideas, pseudoscientific ideas, one of which I'll tell you about later and explain why you need to avoid it at all costs, at least as far as I'm concerned, if you're anything like me as a reader who's serious about milking books for all they're worth. Anyway, failure simply wasn't an option. I had to figure this out. And so I explored and experimented and discovered everything from mindset strategies to memory techniques to even using Thor's hammer while I was reading. Strange but true, and I'm going to show you how that tactic with Thor's hammer works in a moment. The point is that as a result of the techniques that I used, I was able to stay in school. I got my PhD, and then I got a major research grant and wound up traveling the world. And to this day, I'm a professional researcher who shares what I know with people all over the world. And I still use these techniques because I still struggle to focus when reading, but I don't let the struggle win. I get out Thor's hammer and I win the battle every time, and all because of the techniques we're going to talk about today. So if you're new to the Magnetic Memory Method podcast, wherever you're watching it or listening to it, get subscribed. And if you've got a like button, focus your attention in a laser-like way on the thumbs up. Because this is Dr. Anthony Metivier from magneticmemorymethod.com, and I'm inviting you to join the magnetic renaissance for better reading, better understanding, better memory, and ultimately better productivity as you become the architect of your dream and achieve your goals one after the other. Now, the first thing that we have to tackle when it comes to reading and focus is basic stuff. You know this stuff, but we need to go over it again and again and again. I remind myself of it again and again and again because it's foundational. Diet, fitness, sleep. We have every scientific reason to believe that your mind, my mind, they are the product of your physical brain. Take care of your physical body, your physical brain, and your mind is already going to be more focused. I didn't know that when I was in grad school, and it really, really helped to eventually get down to taking care of my body, and it'll help you too. So, lecture over about the body and sleep and nutrition and fitness, but it's really, really important. The next thing that's going to help a lot of people is very simple, and you probably never heard anybody talk about this before. Be patient with authors. Be patient with video people like me and podcasting people like me. Sometimes people say, get to the point. Well, if you know what the point is, why don't you go and make out a video yourself about the topic? The reality is that the person who's putting it together has framed it with the context that they've put it together with because that's how they've processed it. And if you want to know those things from them, be patient with them. They put it together that way for a reason. Even if it's not the best possible way of putting it together for you, You're going to come against this again and again and again, that people have introductions. People have turns of phrase that might not be correct for you. Be patient with them. Now, sometimes you get content that's just bad, and then people blame themselves for their inability to focus on that content. Now, they might be lacking focus because they don't take care of their brain, because they're on too much sugar, or they're unrested, or whatever. But it's often the case that the author or the speaker is writing or producing their content in a way that just simply can't hold your focus. Now, there are some readers who may wind up considering themselves less intelligent than they actually are. And this is really, really sad, because most of the books that I read, and I mean seriously, 98% of the books that I read are not written particularly well. Now, let me give you an example from one of the students in the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass. He came to me recently for help with his reading comprehension. And I asked him for an example. What are you struggling to read with? And he said he couldn't concentrate or remember anything from a book called One Nation Under God by James Moore. This book, which is about the history of prayer in America, look, it's well written in terms of clean prose. But even though the prose is technically well edited, the prose is not particularly clear. Not only that, it's not logically consistent. In fact, it's logically inconsistent. So I made a video for this student, and I said, look, no wonder you can't remember anything you're reading. There's nothing to remember in this because a lot of it is just empty prose that doesn't make any sense. So don't rush to blame yourself if you can't focus when you're reading. It's not necessarily you. And in grad school, a lot of the time, I just wasn't aware of this. I had all these friends who totally understood some of this highfalutin French philosophy. And I'd just be like, what the heck is this person saying? And the reality is that it wasn't particularly good writing in French, and it wasn't good in any language. So you look at the translation, and it also wasn't clear there. It had a lot of deepities, which is a phrase that, it sounds profound on the surface, but when you really poke into it, it's not saying anything at all. So the question is, what do you do when an author is using deepities, when an author is confusing? How do you keep your focus so you can keep plowing forward when there's technically little or nothing to focus on, or the writing is just plain bad, but you have to go forward anyway? Well, you have to bring the engagement. So let me show you what I mean with a specific example. Moore says in this book, One Nation Under God, that nothing in human experience compares to prayer. Now, a sentence like this is really hard to comprehend for a couple of reasons. First, what does the author mean by prayer? And what does he mean by human experience? You might think that this is just a simple sentence and you're like, yeah, okay, nothing compares to prayer. But what exactly does the word compare mean in the context that the author is using? I'm cherry picking this one example to raise a point, because in reality, prayer does compare to all kinds of things. Prayer compares to confession with a priest. Prayer compares to the secular equivalent of confession with a priest, which is called psychoanalysis. Using a mantra compares to prayer, as does wishful thinking and other forms of self-talk. The author then uses an empty cliche phrase like, by any objective measure. But nowhere does the author list a single objective measure. So the absence of an example means that the reader has nothing to latch on to. It's very, very hard to understand this or to process it in your brain, because he's just saying, by any objective measure. Well, what is an objective measure? It's not until page 3 of this book that Moore gives an example that the reader can mentally experience. And the image Moore gives involves a number of people getting together in Yankee Stadium to pray after the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center. So as I explained to the student in the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass, the problem isn't with his focus skills. He was bringing to the table, I'm sure, incredibly strong abilities to read. The fact is that the author was writing, and does write in this book, in vague abstractions that go on for pages on end. The book would be much improved with an introduction like this. Imagine that you're in Yankee Stadium with a group of people gathered in prayer. Your heart is flooded with conflicting emotions, ranging from anger to rage to the need for revenge. and feelings of patriotism for your country. Prayer helps you navigate these tough emotions. And that is just one reason why prayer holds so much value compared to some of the other ways you could deal with the range of confusing feelings you might experience after such a tragic event as 9/11. By rewriting Moore's argument about the value of prayer in my own words, I bring the engagement. I still don't necessarily agree with the author, but as responsible readers, we don't need to agree with the authors. No matter how obscure or meaningless the prose might be, we put the complaints aside, and it's our job to puzzle out the meaning, or pound it out of the book on the forge of our mind. Now, this isn't the Thor's hammer technique I mentioned in the beginning of this video. We're still getting to that special technique, but I raise that metaphor of pounding out the meaning because it's shown that when we dig into a text, when we grapple with it and make it our own, we not only increase our focus, we transform ourselves into better thinkers, communicators, and citizens of planet Earth. And speed reading research shows that if you really want to understand something, you dig into it. You actually read it word for word. That's how the top comprehenders read, word for word, not training their eyes to spin around pages in all kinds of special ways, but digging in and then rewriting the text. So read what the author says. Don't judge yourself if you get confused, but bring the engagement. Even if you understand it, reword it in your own words, constantly translating for yourself what you think the writer means. Blaming yourself when it's actually the author's fault for being boring or confusing is a kind of internal distraction. So we got to get rid of internal distractions, and we also need to delete external distractions. There's nothing worse than having external forces interrupt your reading. Now, not long ago, for example, I was out at one of my favorite reading spots when it started to rain. Suddenly, a bunch of people, they're huddling with me under the umbrella over my favorite picnic table. And then they started chatting away, blah, 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 blah. They seemed to not notice that I was reading, No problem. I just left. I have nearly a dozen other places already charted out where I can read. I know where the library is. I can go there to read if I want. If I'm okay with having some noise around, I can go and read in multiple cafes that have been pre-found, pre-designated as possible reading areas. There's also my home. But how often do we try to push through distractions instead of turning them off or changing locations? Change the environment so that it suits your life as a reader who can focus. In my house, not everybody likes it, but everybody wears headphones on their laptops and their cell phones, and there are no televisions in the Magnetic Memory Method headquarters. None at all. This is because this place is for focus and concentration. Where I live as a serious reader, the environment has minimal noise pollution. Can't do everything that I would like about the neighbors necessarily, but in terms of how we have sounds in this house, we can control that, and it's just a great thing. I wear headphones when I want to listen to music. Everybody else does too, and it's beautiful. Silence is golden when you're a serious reader, and not only that, but when you're thinking about what you're reading, when you're translating it into your own words, whether you write it down or you just translate it mentally, you also need that quiet and that focus. It's really, really important. And we'll talk about the point of quiet a little bit more in a minute that maybe contradicts this to a certain extent, but it's still really, really important. Now, let's talk about using your hands when you're reading, because this is something I think a lot of people miss, and all the more so when they increasingly read in digital formats. Now, I'm not totally speaking against digital formats. I try to avoid them as much as possible, but I find that reading physical books is really, really important, and I use my hands in a particular way called the pinch technique. So it's really rare that I just randomly read things. I try to read with very, very specific targets and then physically read in specific ways and fulfill my reading within specific time frames as much as possible. So for example, when I'm interested in a particular topic, I'll pick 3 to 5 books in that area and plan to have them read within 4 to 6 weeks. And this is a really huge strategy for people who want to read faster. This is what I call a macro target. And I'm doing it right now with a reading project I have going on about physics. Now, 3 to 5 books about physics is not going to make me a master of physics, but it is a nice amount of books inside of a particular time period. Now, those are macro targets. The micro targets are literally figuring out how much I plan to read in a given day or a session. And because I struggle with attention span issues, just like everyone else does in the age of digital amnesia, I use my hands. So to combat my brain wanting to skip around and looking up things on the internet, I use the pinch technique. And the pinch technique is very, very simple. You find a chapter in a book, you grab that amount of pages, and you just hold on to it. And you don't let go until you're done, flipping through the pages like this. That way, this feeling of needing to get up and do something on the internet, looking something up, or doing anything but continuing to flip through the pages of the book until you get to the end of the chapter, that feeling doesn't interrupt nearly as much because you've pinched the amount you're going to read and you just don't stop reading until there's nothing more to pinch. Plus, you get a little bit of that progress effect. You can feel that you're making progress moving forward. And, I don't use this technique all the time. I tend to save the pinch technique for when I really can't focus on reading or when my mind starts telling me, oh, this chapter is so boring and on and on. I know it sounds kind of silly. I don't even like the term pinch technique. I can't think of anything better, but that's what I've come up with. And I've been doing it for years. And it helps me maintain my focus a ton. And I think it will help you too if you struggle to sit down and read. If you have the book in front of you and you're not really physically engaged with it, it's a way of being physically engaged with it. I don't have a digital version of this, so it's really for physical books. But maybe you can imagine and think and let me know if you figure out a way to do something like this with a digital book. But I find it really, really useful. And there's a variation on the pinch technique as well. When you start feeling like you need a dopamine hit from the internet and you're really itching to go and look something up, I like to breathe into my hands. So what does that mean? It's really just thinking mentally of the air going into my hands. Now, sometimes this can make you feel a little bit drowsy and so forth, but usually not. I just manage to breathe heavy air as if my hands are concrete and holds me in place. I think this is inspired a little bit by my mom. She had a fear of flying, and she said she used to imagine the hand of God underneath the airplane, holding it up. Maybe that's where I got that idea. But it helped her with her fear. It's a mental image. And I am a very twitchy individual. I have so many thoughts going on a lot of the time. And I read a name in a book, and I go, oh, I got to look that up. I can always look it up later. Forward progress through the book is so much more important. So I just breathe into my hands and hold on with that silly term pinch technique and just get through the reading. So usually I find within 2 to 3 breaths, I forget the distraction and I settle back into focused reading. Now, here's another strategy that I love that has to do with physical books but does apply to digital books. Learning How to Learn is a delightful little book by Barbara Oakley and Terry Sinowski. And, you can use memory techniques to remember a name like Sinowski. It was fun for me to use memory techniques to remember that. Anyway, this book introduces a technique called the picture walk technique. And it is really, really wonderful. What you do, instead of diving into a chapter and just reading it, you might get the pinch technique going for yourself. And then before you start reading, you flip through and the picture walk shows you all of these different images and diagrams and feature boxes in the book. So in this case, you're going through the chapter first and you're giving your brain a bit of priming, a bit of a highlight of the things yet to come. And by having a quick look for these charts and graphs and diagrams, you're also giving yourself something to look forward to, and you can pause upon those and read them first so that you actually understand them better when you get to them. You can do this on digital, obviously, because you can flip through pages through books in digital and do a picture walk and see what might be there to come. But what do you do if the book doesn't have any illustrations or diagrams? Well, that's useful to know in advance as well. It can help you brace for impact from the walls of text so you can better focus your mind on the reading task to be done. So one way or the other, knowing what a chapter looks like in advance shows you the territory. It shines some light on what you're getting into, and you can decide to spend a couple minutes thinking about what those pictures are about, making some guesses, reading some of the little text that's underneath those pictures, and so on, right? So this is really, really powerful, and you can combine it with the pinch technique. Now let's take the picture walk strategy to the next level. One of the easiest ways to lose focus while reading is insisting on reading from beginning to end. Now, I read novels from beginning to end normally. Sometimes I'll check out what it says on the final page, but usually with novels, that's really not that helpful. You want to be surprised. But when reading nonfiction books, I almost always read the conclusion first. This way, you get a little summary of the key points of the book and why the author thinks that the thesis of the book was valuable and correct. I just did that with Brian Clegg's book on infinity, and I'm so glad I did. It made the introduction so much more fun and engaging. Of course, not all books have conclusions, and not all conclusions sum things up in as valuable a way as I'm suggesting. But nonetheless, reading nonfiction books out of order is a generally valuable principle for increasing engagement. I also like to read through the indexes to kind of like concept walk, finding things like, oh, Nietzsche comes up in this book. And then I sometimes go and just read those parts to prime my mind for how the author is using Nietzsche. Oh, talks about Aristotle, this, that, and the other thing. This is really, really powerful because it helps you understand the context of the book. Remember, the content may be king, but context is God. And the more you open up and widen your context, the bigger your field of reference is, and the more engaged you are for trying to solve the puzzle of how exactly the author uses things you already know and how that it's going to fit together in the grand scope of the book. Now, speaking of Clegg's book on infinity, here's something really, really important. It has the word unthinkable in the title. And when we want to focus when reading, thinking the unthinkable is a clue we can use. Clegg quotes the physicist Richard Feynman to give us a mental model that I think is really, really useful. During a presentation to the public, Feynman once told his audience, "It is my task to convince you to not turn away from physics because you don't understand it." You see, my students don't understand it either. That's because I don't understand it. Nobody does. I mention this quote and this idea of thinking the unthinkable because when you don't understand and you can't focus, maybe you don't focus because you're reading something that is not understandable, or you're trying to understand what it is that other people don't understand. Now, it might be true that you need to go back and do some foundational reading first, and when that's the case, go and do that reading. I got this book on infinity because I'm trying to read about physics, and I really don't have enough understanding of what infinity is to get where I want to go. So I go back and do some foundational reading that helps me focus more on this concept. I'm getting the prerequisite knowledge needed to follow the plot. Now, that said, Sir Roger Penrose, he says something similar to Feynman in his introduction to the amazing book, The Road to Reality. Penrose basically says that most people have more than enough mathematical understanding to follow what he's saying in the book, but they trick themselves into thinking they don't. And he says it's okay to skip the equations, which when you do a picture walk, you'll see he's got quite a lot of equations and diagrams and geometry in the book. But Penrose says he's keeping all of those equations in there because they're useful for many readers, and quite frankly, he thinks they are the road to reality. And so Penrose reminded me of this Feynman quote because time and again, both Feynman and Penrose and many, many authors of many topics, not just physics and math, they are writing so that they might better understand their topics, but they're not pretending that they do understand it. And the function of a lot of writing is not just to teach or lecture. It's not just to have people enjoy the sound of their own voice. Of course we enjoy the sound of our own voices. It's because we're dialoguing with each other, either with the public at large or with their peers. And sometimes we stumble into books that are written by specialists for specialists. So don't necessarily think that you can't focus because you don't understand it. It could be that you just need to get a simpler book on the topic or 2 to 3 simpler books. And it could also be that nobody knows what they're talking about and it can't be known. Now, before we get to the Thor technique, Read with Momentum starts soon. So if you want to be able to read with momentum, even things that you don't understand and will never understand because nobody understands them, not even Richard Feynman understood them while he was alive, Read with Momentum is a live cohort program where we go through how to read books effectively and efficiently with assignments and open discussion following my detailed presentations where I unfold everything I know as a professional scholar about reading. Read with Momentum is based on a course I used to teach at Rutgers, And I improved that course over many years at universities in Canada, in Germany, and I've improved it from here in the Magnetic Memory Method headquarters where I'm sitting now. So if you'd like to be notified when registration opens for the upcoming cohort of Read with Momentum, go to magneticmerrymethod.com/RWM. Now, finally, on to Thor's hammer. I love this technique. It's so powerful. Now, if you are in the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass and you've developed your magnetic SRS, which stands for Self-Reinforcing System, you may know that Thor is one of my go-to figures for memorizing many words that start with TH. For example, I use him when memorizing the word the in a memory palace. Or check out this line I memorized from Shakespeare. If there be nothing new but that which is hath been before, how are our brains beguiled? Oh, I love that one. So for the word there, I have Thor adjusting his hair. For the word that, I have Thor doing something with a hat. So if there be nothing new, well, Thor for there, TH, Thor, and then doing something with his hair, air, there, right? If there be nothing new but that which is, hath been before, now that, I have him doing something with a hat. Using mnemonic imagery, or what I like to think of as magnetic imagery like that, is not only just about memorizing words. It's about reasserting your focus while reading and being able to do it in a flash, to think of another comic character. So when I catch my mind wandering while reading, which happens more often than I would like, but it still happens, I look for the word the on the page, then I imagine Thor smashing his hammer down on the page. This reasserts my focus. And this mental experience is so loud and dynamic and funny that it brings my attention back to the reading. Now this is basically using the peg word method, and you can have an image for each and every letter of the alphabet. So it doesn't have to be the word the, but this tactic helps you instantly look at anything you're reading if you have an image for every letter of the alphabet, which is a key part of the magnetic memory method. And you can use it to engage with anything you're reading much deeper, completely on demand, and you can do it for numbers, you can do it for symbols. You can have images for every number, either from 0 to 9 or from 00 to 99. And if you want to go higher than that, you can have images for 3-digit numbers, for 4-digit numbers, 5-digit numbers, etc. But really, if you have a 00 to 99 set of images, then you can just double them up, or you can combine a 0 to 9 number system with the 00 to 99 system. So if you have a 3-digit number, you have something from your 00 to 99 and your single-digit system together. Now, I know that sounds like a mouthful, and if you haven't used memory techniques or developed this system, you could be thinking, like, what the heck is this guy talking about? All the more reason to get involved in one of my programs, because they're very, very powerful, and it's just that simple. You have images for every letter of the alphabet. You have images for every number that you encounter. And if you want, you can have images for every symbol, or you can know the names of symbols, and then you know the alphabetical letter that starts the word of the symbol, like ampersand, or asterisk, or caret. All of those things can have images based on either the symbol itself, what the symbol looks like, or the word for the symbol that you then associate alphabetically. It's very, very powerful. And whenever you're reading, you never have to throw your hands up in the air. You can just say, what am I going to do to reassert my focus and just get back to business focusing on this? Because I now know that the top readers who understand the most, they actually focus on the content that they're reading. They don't skip around, they don't skim, they don't sort, sift, and screen and all that sort of stuff. They actually read it. I'm having trouble with focus. I use these techniques to reassert my focus. Power. It's very, very powerful. Not force, but power. Power through reference. Power through association. Power through the magnetic memory method. All right, I got one more tip for you and one more resource. And I want you to know that there are even more tips for focusing on reading on my blog. So assuming you're not watching this video on my blog already, the link for the blog itself will be in the description below, or you can just search magneticmerrymethod.com and how to focus when reading. So the Thor method has been really, really important for me, and more broadly, I've found it useful to fly directly against one of the most bizarre and pseudoscientific things I've ever seen. This is the idea in the speed reading world that you should suppress your sub-vocalization. This is not only, well, look, I don't even know where to begin with this. Not only does the science on reading prove beyond a doubt that you really have no benefit from stopping your subvocalization, assuming you even can, it suggests that the people telling you this have misunderstood the science that they read, and if they actually read it in a speed reading way, well, then the speed reading didn't really help them that much. It's kind of sad. It's really, really almost at the level of a crime against humanity. And when I can't understand, I don't sit around trying to suppress my subvocalization so I can read faster. What does it matter how fast I read if I'm not understanding it? What does it matter how fast I read if I'm reading in the wrong direction? When I can't understand, I read out loud. I read out loud twice if I have to. And if I don't want to disturb someone who's around me, I just move my mouth to get it through my mouth to help aid comprehension. And there is no shame in doing this at all. In fact, I love it. And so did our ancestors. If you read in the vineyard of the text, which I told you about in my video on Hugh of St. Victor's imaginary memory palace method, you'll learn a lot about how if you saw someone reading quietly, your friends and teachers might think you'd gone insane. Our ancestors used to read out loud all the time. It was very, very important. Reading was a social thing. Reading was something that we understood and we remembered better by saying things out loud. So even if you disagree with me, please go in caution if you come across people telling you to suppress subvocalization. So many people have reached out to me asking for tips and strategies to suppress their subvocalization. They have heard about this. Look, there are cults out there that twist people's minds. There's nothing wrong with your mind if you get caught in this idea. It's because these people are very, very convincing. They have rhetorical strategies that they use. But it's a sad, weird, and almost criminal suggestion that you suppress your subvocalization. Listen, concentration is something that is built. And it is built upon using all the tools you have at your disposal. You don't have to suppress muscles and skills and talents that you have as a human being with a body. Amplify those skills and those assets. And your voice is one of the most powerful tactics you have. Your mouth is one of the most amazing inventions of evolution. So the best tip of them all is to increase the amount of things that you're reading, the amount of books, the amount of articles, and then talk with as many people as you can. Talk out loud with your mouth about what you're reading. I really appreciate all the comments that I get about my videos and podcasts. Please keep them coming. But when I say talk about what you're reading, talk about what you're studying or watching in videos or listening on podcasts, I'm not talking about typing into a screen. I'm talking about real conversation that not only uses your subvocalization, but the full Thor-like hammer power of your vocalization. And it's so worth repeating that when you are reading and when you're having conversations about reading, bring patience to the game, both with the authors that you're reading, the people you're watching videos from, and the people that you speak with about those things. Not everybody is on the same page. Not everybody has spent the same amount of time. And patience is a huge virtue, and it will make a much better future. So many books that I have read and I have benefited from and I love, they are simply not well written. And it's never your fault when you come across books like that, but it is your responsibility to dig deeply into them and use all of your forces of representation, including your voice, to help you understand them better. When I struggled to concentrate, I recorded myself reading books. I made my own audiobooks. And then I listened to myself read them in order to get the job done. Because this is what the science of reading tells us. The people who get the most out of books read in detail. So you have now some of my best reading strategies that have to do with focus so you can get through even the toughest texts. If you need more help and you want to learn more about how to remember what you read, thank you for being here. And if you see my video for how to read a book on the screen, go ahead, watch that next. Look for the link to the additional training down below if you don't see it on the screen, or just search on the internet for how to read a book and magnetic memory method. I hope this has helped you out. These are the real deal techniques that I actually practice. I've tested many other things. Training my eyes to operate in certain ways, suppressing subvocalization simply did not help. There is no scientific reason to believe that it will help anybody in any way who really wants to read and understand and remember what they're reading. But what we've heard about today, reasserting focus by using your voice, by using imagery, by really getting physical with books, having your fingers in those pages and pinching them after doing a picture walk or a concept walk through the index, that is a thing that you can repeat over and over again with any book to constantly reassert your focus. And it's part of reading with momentum. So thank you again for joining me for this episode of the Magnetic Memory Method podcast. Get out there and read with momentum. And until we have a chance to speak again, keep yourself magnetic. Hey Cheshire, of all these books in this library, what would you say is the most difficult? Are you kidding? All of them. Oh, come on, Cheshire, what kind of attitude is that? Hey, wait a second. Let's turn that frown upside down with some of my best tips for dealing with boring, tedious, frustrating books that you don't want to read, but you have to read, and you have to remember them too.